Well, good morning. Hurricane Dorian was a close call for Florida. We had a storm that had ferocity like which we've not really seen at 185 mile per hour winds, very low barometric pressure, and that was wreaking havoc 100 miles, 120 miles off Florida's east coast. And that was something that represented a very serious threat to the state of Florida. Our mantra throughout this was we weren't sure which path the storm was going to take. We hoped for the best, but we had to prepare for the worst. And I want to thank all our emergency managers and law enforcement personnel at the local level who really worked hard, executed their plans, and did their best to protect their folks. I want to thank our state emergency personnel. I want to thank Jared for his leadership. They were working around the clock. They were prepared. And also thank our federal partners. They were here with us from the very beginning. They recognized the threat that this storm represented, and they governed themselves accordingly. And I also want to thank all Floridians for hanging in there during what was a frustrating process. This was a storm where we had a cone of uncertainty last week covering almost the entire state of Florida. And people weren't sure what direction it was going to take. We were all kind of on the edge of our seats watching the hurricane advisories coming out by the National Hurricane Center, trying to figure out what we were looking at. And it required preparations. Then it also was a storm that was very slow to move. It ended up basically being standstill for almost a day and a half, it seemed like. And so, it's a frustrating experience, but I think Floridians, by and large, hung in there. And I want to thank them for what they did during this process. Keep our friends in the Carolinas in your thoughts and prayers. This storm has gotten stronger since it passed Florida's northeast coast. It's back up to a Category 3. It's bearing down on places like Charleston, Myrtle Beach, and the North Carolina Outer Banks, and that will cause potentially significant damage. And so if we're asked, we've not been requested yet to send any mutual aid, but states stepped up for us, and so if we're asked to send mutual aid, we will do that for our friends in the Carolinas. With respect to the Bahamas, obviously we've seen some of those islands there just get absolutely leveled. Some of these buildings had no chance with the storm that strong. I've asked former U.S. Ambassador to the Bahamas, John Rood, who lives in Northeast Florida, to coordinate and be kind of Florida's point person for ways that we can do relief for the Bahamas. I've talked with the feds about it. Obviously, they're trying to figure out what they can do to be helpful with the Bahamas. If there's a request from the federal government for National Guard support, we will honor that and support the relief efforts. I've also talked with Jared. We have a lot of supplies. I think mainly we're looking at some of the water. We have hundreds of thousands of bottles of water for this hurricane season that are going to expire when the hurricane season ends. And so we're not out of the woods with hurricane season. Obviously, we're at the peak. But there's obviously a chance we don't have a storm and then that water would go to waste. So we're going to be moving some of that water to the Bahamas. Jared's confident that if we did face a storm 3 or 4 weeks down the road, that we'd be able to backfill that with no problem. But I don't want that to go to waste if we have the ability to use that to help some folks. One thing I would tell Floridians, because I know a lot of Floridians travel the Bahamas, in our interactions with what the Bahamians are talking about is I think the Bahamians want people to understand that they have many islands in the Bahamas. Some islands were decimated, others were not. And so if you have plans to go to the Bahamas, check to see, because if some of these places like Atlantis made it through the storm okay, canceling those plans doesn't help them with their recovery. I mean, they are driven in large part by tourism, and they want to keep their engine going for the areas, in many areas in the Bahamas, that were not negatively affected, or at least at that scale, that are still operating. And so I'll deliver that message. Obviously, we recognize how many Floridians have relationships with the Bahamas, whether for vacation. A lot of those islands that got really leveled, I mean, you probably have a lot of Floridian property owners in some of those places, and probably have pretty extensive damage there for them. So keep them in your thoughts and prayers. Volunteer Florida, if you go to our website there, we now have places where you can donate donate not only to Bahamas, but any Floridians who were affected negatively by the storm here. And it's got all kind of the approved organizations that go through the vetting and whatnot, so folks can take a look at that. And then Ambassador Root, he's actually going to be in the Bahamas today and going to kind of let us know, hey, what makes sense. You know, a lot of people want to help, which is good. It's a great impulse, but we also don't want this stuff ending up in some warehouse where it never ends up being used by anybody. We want to make sure that whatever our efforts are done are targeted in a way that's actually going to bring relief to folks over there. So again, a close call for us, but I think we all did the right thing to take this storm very seriously and prepare accordingly. And when you go through these processes, there's nothing like the real thing. I mean, we did a major hurricane exercise earlier in the year, and that was helpful, but I think this really, helped a lot of these folks hone their skills and try to make us even better going forward. And with that, we'll take some questions.
Now that you've had a day to kind of process some of the initial reports, what were the impacts that Dorian had on the state of Florida?
So we had, I think, Jared, in terms of what we have right now and estimates, I mean, we probably had tens of millions of dollars in damage up along the coast, a lot of beach damage. We obviously are still going to be getting some information on that. So I think we can probably say, and Jared can correct me if I'm wrong, that there will be damage, but the damage will be less than what was experienced during Hurricane Matthew, which obviously from where we were last week, looking at a potential Southeast Florida impact, that's something that we'll be able to deal with.
Turn to the Lieutenant Governor for a second.
Several deaths reported as people prepared for this storm. Are you keeping track of that? And do we know what that number is?
Well, I think this morning the number I had was there was one death for somebody who was trying to trim trees. So it was an accident. And then there was another death, a gentleman in a shelter, very elderly, passed away. I don't think we have any additional information about exactly why, maybe natural causes. I think we got to figure that out. But those are, I think, the two that we have, that we've gotten reports on so far.
Governor, question about the disaster declaration that the president had signed. In reading this, my understanding is that the president was very specific, and he said for Category B, which is for emergency protective measures, was limited to direct federal assistance. There's some local agencies out there that are worried that that means that the shelters that were opened are going to be responsible, the responsibility of the locals to pay for, contrary to previous storms where FEMA would actually provide assistance under the 75-25.
So basically, right. So they approved direct federal assistance. We wanted the declaration pre-landfall for the protective measures. And they basically were like, well, let's see what happens with the storm. So we've amended our request. We are asking for that. I think we probably will get it because FEMA's in a situation where these counties and the state, we did what you would want us to do. I mean, we actually took steps to prepare. And I think if the idea that because the storm moved a little one way, that somehow they're going to be left holding that entire bag, that sends the message to folks, well, maybe skimp on that next time. And what that'll end up leading to is when a storm does hit, the damage will be worse from the federal perspective because they'll have to pay more money. So that request was sent in last night. Jared's been working with them. Obviously, I've spoken with the president about it and told him, hey, this is important for us locally. And he's basically said, look, we're going to help you out with whatever you need, not getting into the details. And he's been great with this stuff. I mean, if you remember with Hurricane Michael, we had not reached the total damage threshold where that 90-10 kicks in automatically. The president had the authority to do it, but we did not. And we basically said, myself, Senator Rubio, others, this was a Category 5 storm. And we've only had a handful of those hit the continental U.S. So you have to look at this, and he got it, and he did it. So, but Jared's sensitive, and I'm sensitive to the local governments that spent money doing the right thing, that we have a system that incentivizes them to do the right thing rather than disincentivizes them. Yes, sir.
Can I ask the Lieutenant Governor, was there, speak specifically to the preparations in South Florida for this storm? And specifically, was there any special sense of tension, or was this another, we have booze, we'll handle it situation?
No, I think South Florida heeded the call. We initially were looking at an impact, and I think as the governor mentioned, South Florida took this very seriously, and so they indeed incurred some costs in preparing. Eventually, we were taken out of the cone, but I think that speaks to the volume and the level of preparedness that we need to maintain. So.
We actually, though, I mean, you saw people in Miami-Dade rush into the gas station, water flying off the shelf. Jared and I were like, well, people are getting it from Amazon. So people went on Amazon and they that was gone very quickly. So people were, I mean, I think people in South Florida took a lot of precautions, which is a good thing, in terms of what we were facing.
Can you tell us whether you agree with what Senator Rubio and Senator Scott have asked the president to do, and that is waive visa requirements for Bahamian refugees who have family members in Florida?
I haven't seen what they've requested. I spoke with Senator Rubio today just about general what we need to do in Florida. We did talk about the Bahamas. He said that the Bahamas basically, they're not asking for things like temporary protective status, that basically they want people to remain there. Most of their islands are functioning, and they wanted to get that message out. So I'm not sure in terms of what the visa situation would be, and obviously that would be something that the Trump administration is going to have to make a determination on. But I think that we're in a situation where we have a chance in Florida to be helpful, and I think we want to do that.
It's just a matter of, will you be welcoming people who don't have a place to
Well,
temporarily
it's
live in Florida?
Right, but those are not my decisions to make. I mean, those are the decisions of the federal government. This is different than Hurricane Maria, because Hurricane Maria affected American territory, so you had U.S. citizens coming. People have the right to do that if they're U.S. citizens. When you're foreign nationals, that has to be done consistent with whatever the federal policy is, and so we'll see how that shakes out.
Governor, in the run-up to the storm, you warned the nursing homes that they would be held accountable if patient safety wasn't taken into account. Does the preparation sort of pointed out the deficiencies in the preparation? Does more follow-up needed before a future storm for nursing homes?
Well, I would give credit to Mary Mayhew, the secretary, because she really leaned into this. And so we knew in these coastal counties, everyone that had the generator, which was most of them, and then if you didn't, did you have an evacuation plan? And they did in those counties. And I think a lot of the reasons they did is because they knew that there was scrutiny on this, and I think the state's efforts were helpful in that. And my thing on the whole thing is, obviously having a generator is one way, but the problem that happened in Broward was, if they just would have had an evacuation plan, they would have been able to protect those folks. And so there's more than one way to do it. I think you got to know what your resources are locally, how hard it would be to evacuate, how many people are in your care, all that. But yeah, and then we're going to go on the back end and also look to see how all that was done, and then move forward accordingly. But I think that the prosecution that was initiated very recently sent a strong signal that if you are not protecting these folks, if you're grossly negligent, that you can be held accountable, not just in terms of monetary, but potential criminal liability.
Director Moskowitz yesterday said one of the reasons the storm missed us was because of the prayer you left in the Western Wall.
Well, look, all I can tell you is, and you were over there, we had a storm. I mean, last week the storm was a beeline, a buzzsaw across South Florida, and it kind of stalled out and turned pretty dramatically 90 degrees to the north. And so if we had a hand in assisting that, I'm not going to argue with the big guy upstairs, but it was a situation where, for the last 4 or 5 days in this thing, once we knew it probably wasn't going to go all the way across to southern Florida to southwest Florida, we were looking at some type of South Florida impact, and then north. We knew it was going to go north. And I was just, my theme song was the Byrds, turn, turn, turn. Just like, can it please turn as quickly as possible? And it did turn in a way that obviously was very, very beneficial. And these things are games of inches in terms of a wobble here or there. I mean, Jared and I are sitting there, and the National Hurricane Center is telling us this thing is going to stall. All the data we have, it will stall and it will turn north. It's not going to make a major impact on Florida, maybe snip the coast. But, we're thinking about, can you just assume this thing's going to stop? I mean, it was really, really hard to believe that could possibly happen. And so, we were on edge that whole time just thinking about, because Matthew came from much further south and was more of a northern track where you could see how that would kind of get bounced off the coast. This one was one where it really did make a pretty strong right-hand turn. And obviously, we're much better for that. We were looking at a potential situation where you're hitting our most populous part of the state, but then potentially damaging communities all up along Florida, and that would have been a really, really big problem. All right, so this is kind of a wrap for us. Jared's going to shut this down by the weekend. The REOC will be stood down. I know a lot of the counties are already back to normal, and but we'll be following up obviously with some of the reimbursements or whatnot, and we're just going to hope that that we get spared for the rest of the hurricane season. And
Are you going to bring out the Navy ball cap?
it's funny. The Coast Guard asked me would I be willing to wear a Coast Guard cap, and I said not on your life. So.
Down to any of the coastal areas?
Probably not. I mean, we were planning on it, but I think that the damage has been relatively modest. That I think I'd just be getting in people's way. So yeah, we're not going to do that. Obviously, Jared's going to be monitoring any additional damage assessments that come through. But look, I mean, I was there for Matthew, and I mean that could have been a lot worse too. There was some pretty extensive damage. The fact that this went further east, we really are fortunate that we weren't dealing with more major impacts.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.